At the end of the last week, our larger podcast ended with a question on optimism and what were some of the reasons that we could be optimistic going forward. I think we focused on a couple of political answers and current event oriented answers. And, I left that thinking about it. And then I had kind of a crappy week. And you look back at 2020 and the start of this year, and there's just been so many reasons to be pessimistic and so many terrible things to read about when you open up the news or you watch anything online. I really wanted to find some good news, find some things to maybe rejuvenate us and give us reasons to be optimistic going into 2021. So, you know what? Belated Happy New Year. I'm going to cover 5 areas, and I hope that in less than 10 minutes, you can leave feeling a little bit better about the world and how things are going from a macro level. Let's start with disease. How can I start with disease? We're in the middle of a pandemic. Well, just a couple of decades ago, there was a huge pandemic too, and it was HIV/AIDS. Probably haven't heard much about that lately.
The global devastation of HIV/AIDS staggers the imagination and shocks the conscience.
Did you know, back in 2003, more than 1 in 3 deaths in many countries were due to HIV/AIDS. And if we rewind the time and look at what happened, you took a conservative president, a liberal rock star, a wildly successful businessman, and some bipartisan support to push through what's known as PEPFAR, or the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. That program covered prevention, treatment, and care. It reports to Congress on an annual basis for accountability, and it still is live today. It was a global initiative led by the United States to provide antiretroviral drugs to fight AIDS, and it was extremely successful. There have been over 17 million lives saved to date. That's amazing. Next in disease is malaria. That same wildly successful businessman, maybe you guessed, Bill Gates, he took a passion to solving malaria.
For example, there's more money put into baldness drugs than are put into malaria. Now, baldness it's a terrible thing. And rich men are afflicted. And so that's why that priority has been set.
For back in the year 2000, there was nearly 1 million deaths a year due to malaria. And just 15 years later, that number was down to 438,000. Africa, in particular sub-Saharan Africa, that was also devastated by HIV/AIDS, was once home to 9 out of 10 malaria victims, and that's the area that's seen the most success in recent years. We can't really talk about disease much further without mentioning COVID, and while numbers right now are really bad, I do think we need to pause and celebrate American ingenuity and scientific progress. We produced not one, but many vaccines in record time. We went from a 28-year timeline to developing the first effective flu vaccines to just 11 months for the vaccines that we see being distributed today. And well, now we're hearing about some concern about mutations and variants of COVID-19. Leading scientists do express some optimism about being able to turn those vaccines around even more quickly going forward.
200 million people at any one time are suffering from it.
Totally different area to be optimistic in. Poverty. Extreme poverty is a term used to describe people that live on less than $2 a day. Through most of human history, prior to 1820 at least, that was over 94% of the world's population. 94% of the world's population living in extreme poverty. But the spread of capitalism, global economic growth, foreign aid, and the efforts of many nonprofits, churches, etc., by 2015, that measure was less than 10%. That meant almost 1 billion people were pulled out of extreme poverty. That's a phenomenal statistic. Looked another way, back in 1970, over a quarter of the people living worldwide were living on less than $1 a day. The United States today estimates that more poverty was reduced in the last 50 years than in the previous 500. A third area to be optimistic about is global health. And there are 2 great metrics that track this. One is life expectancy and one is infant mortality. Even in 1960, the global average life expectancy at birth was only 52 years. Now that's over 71. In America, in 1890, 22% of new births resulted in child death. Today, the worldwide population-weighted child mortality rate is just 3%. That means there's been a steady decline of over 121 deaths per 1,000 births, down to 31. The next area to be optimistic about is population growth, food, and the environment. Of course, one of the largest influencers on the environment is food and agriculture. And you may have heard of a guy named Thomas Malthus and the Malthusian trap, if I'm pronouncing those correctly. In the late 18th century, Thomas Malthus wrote that he believed that an increase in population would always outpace the means of food production. Unfortunately, that's proven not to be true, for in fact, as global population has increased, our food supply has kept pace. This is measured by a lot of different statistics like vegetable yields per hectare of land, but one of the ones that I think is more interesting is calorie consumption. And since 1961, calorie consumption per person in the world on average has increased by more than 600 calories. That really means a significant improvement in quality of life, because the worldwide total of undernourished people has plummeted since 1992. Just then, it was approaching 1 billion people, and today it's under 700 million. Of course, along the way, you can imagine that improvements to technology and the spread of power plants has improved access to electricity significantly over that time. And while that has enabled better agricultural growth and yields, we actually see greenhouse gases from agricultural initiatives steadily decreasing. So that's good news. The fifth area for optimism is labor. A few of us in this podcast work in technology, and while technology cannot create more hours in the day, it does allow us to do more with the hours that we have. In 1950, the average annual number of hours worked per worker equated to a 43-hour work week. Now that's under 36 hours. And while you and I might work more than a 40-hour work week, the reality is that's significant when you look across all the people in the globe and the amount of tedious manual labor that they're doing. In addition to that time being reduced, the actual productivity per hour has increased significantly. This is measured on a dollar scale pretty impressively. Back in 1950, it was estimated that 1 hour of work equated to $9.30 of productivity. Today, that number is over $37. All right, so where did I get all these numbers? And for those of you that want to fact check me, where can you go? There's a couple of options. One of my favorites is there's a website called ourworldindata.org, and it's got all kinds of these great charts and graphs across many different areas of interest, and you can drill down into lots of nerdy details. The other is, I just finished a book recently by Jonah Goldberg, and it's called Suicide of the West, and it's a really dense but interesting read on the uniqueness and specialness of capitalism and how the United States fits into that and where we are in the timeline of capitalism and what that means. But there's an appendix at the end of that book that's got some really amazing statistics similar to and including some of the same ones I quoted here, and endnotes to prove it. So I hope that you found this interesting. I hope that this gives you some optimism going forward. While there's plenty of things to be pessimistic and negative about, overall, the world is so much better off than it was even 50 years ago. Good luck. Take care. Be safe. See you in the next pod.
Thanks for listening to 2 Men in the Middle. Make sure to give us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. Check out our website at 2meninthemiddle.com. Drop us an email at 2meninthemiddle@gmail.com or tweet at us at 2 Men in the Middle. We'll see you next week.